Danny Morrison stepped off the transport ship and looked around at his new home for the next year. Stellar Heights University was the biggest school in the galaxy, and he was the first human student they had accepted in 20 years. The buildings were made of some kind of crystal that changed colors in the sunlight, and floating platforms carried students between the towers that reached up into the clouds. Danny pulled his backpack higher on his shoulders. It was heavy with books about Earth history that he hoped to share with his new classmates. He had always loved learning about the past, especially old wars and how people fought long ago. His major was military archaeology, which meant he studied how ancient people made weapons and built forts. As he walked across the main plaza, other students stopped to stare at him. Most had never seen a human before. There were tall blue aliens, called Zephyrians, who looked like they were made of living crystal. Their skin sparkled when they moved and their eyes glowed with soft light. A group of them whispered to each other as Danny passed by. Near the fountain, some Aquarians were sitting together. They had long tentacles instead of arms and breathed through gills on their necks. Their skin was smooth and wet-looking, colored in shades of green and purple. One of them waved a tentacle at Danny in what he hoped was a friendly greeting. The strangest aliens were the Verdani. They looked almost like walking trees, with bark-like skin and leaves that grew from their heads and shoulders. Danny had read that they talked by changing the colors of their leaves instead of using words. Right now, the leaves of the Verdani. Students were turning bright yellow and orange, which his guidebook said meant they were curious. Danny found his way to the registration building, where a small robot helped him get his class schedule and room assignment. The robot spoke in a cheerful voice and gave him a map of the campus. It also handed him a special badge that would translate any alien language into English for him. His first class was Galactic History, taught by Professor Kethvar. Danny was excited about this one. He loved history, and he was curious to learn about what had happened in other parts of the galaxy while humans were still learning to make fire. The next morning, Danny woke up early and put on his best clothes. He wanted to make a good impression on his first day. He grabbed his notebook and headed to the history building, which was shaped like a giant spiral shell. The classroom was huge, with seats arranged in circles around a central platform where the professor would stand. Students were already taking their seats when Danny arrived. He picked a spot in the third row and smiled at the Zephyrian girl sitting next to him. Her crystal skin turned a pale pink color, which he thought might mean she was embarrassed or shy. Professor Kethvar entered the room, and Danny could see why everyone respected him. The professor was old even for a Zephyrian, and his crystal skin had turned a deep blue color that sparkled like stars. He moved slowly, but with dignity, and when he spoke, his voice filled the entire room without seeming loud. "Welcome, students, to Galactic History," Professor Kethvar began. "This semester we will study the great events that shaped our galaxy. We will learn about the rise and fall of civilizations, the spread of peace across the stars, and the hard lessons learned from our darkest times." The professor touched a control panel, and images appeared in the air above his head. Danny saw pictures of space battles, burning cities, and alien soldiers fighting with weapons that shot beams of light. "Today, we begin with the Great Unification Wars," Professor Kethvar said. His voice became serious and sad. "These conflicts occurred 3,000 years ago and nearly destroyed our galaxy. They were the most terrible wars in all of recorded history." Danny leaned forward in his seat. He loved learning about ancient wars, and these sounded really interesting. The pictures showed spaceships shooting at each other and aliens in armor fighting on the surfaces of planets. "The Great Unification Wars lasted for 30 years, the professor continued. 7 different alien species fought against each other across dozens of star systems. Entire worlds were threatened. The violence was beyond anything we had ever seen before. A Verdani student's leaves turned dark red, which Danny's guidebook said meant sadness or grief. Some of the Aquarians were making soft whistling sounds that seemed to be their way of showing they were upset. "The death toll was staggering," Professor Kethvar said, his crystal skin dimming with sorrow. "When the wars finally ended, we counted our losses. 347 beings had died. Entire families were destroyed. Some species lost nearly a dozen individuals. Danny blinked in surprise. He looked around the classroom to see if anyone else seemed confused, but all the alien students were nodding seriously or showing signs of distress. The Zephyrian girl next to him had turned completely white and her glow was barely visible. Danny raised his hand politely. He wanted to make sure he had heard correctly. "Yes, Danny Morrison of Earth?" Professor Kethver said, reading his name from a list. "I'm sorry, Professor, but did you say the Great Unification Wars lasted 30 years and killed 347 people total?" Danny asked. He tried to keep his voice respectful, but he was genuinely confused. The entire classroom went silent. Every alien student turned to stare at Danny. Professor Kethvar's glow flickered and his skin color shifted to a darker blue. "Yes, Danny Morrison," the professor said slowly. 347 beings died in 30 years of the most brutal warfare our galaxy has ever known. These wars nearly tore apart the fabric of our civilization. The violence was unprecedented in its scale and cruelty. Danny nodded, trying to understand. On Earth, they had wars where more people died in a single day than had died in this entire galactic conflict. But he could see that everyone in the room was taking this very seriously, so he tried to be respectful. "That's very sad, Professor," Danny said. "Those wars sound terrible. On Earth, we had something similar called the 100 Years' War. It actually lasted 116 years, and somewhere between 2 and 3 million people died. But we just call it a regular war, not even one of our biggest ones." The silence in the room became complete. Danny could hear the air circulation system humming and the distant sound of students talking in the hallway outside. But inside the classroom, no one moved or made a sound. The Zephyrian girl next to Danny made a small gasping sound, and her crystal skin went completely transparent. Across the room, a Verdani student's leaves turned white and began falling off. 2 Aquarians near the back started changing colors rapidly, cycling through purple, red, and yellow in a way that looked panicked. Professor Kethver stood frozen at his podium, staring at Danny with wide, glowing eyes. His mouth moved, but no words came out. Finally, he managed to speak in a voice that was barely a whisper. "Did you say that 3 million deaths in one war?" Danny realized he might have said something wrong, but he wasn't sure what. "Well, yes, sir. That's just an estimate, though. Record-keeping wasn't very good back then, so it might have been more or less. Some historians think it could have been as high as 5 million if you count deaths from disease and famine caused by the war." A Verdani student fell over sideways, her leaves scattering across the floor. One of the Aquarians started making high-pitched whistling sounds that Danny's translator couldn't interpret. The Zephyrian girl next to him was shaking so hard that her crystal skin was making tiny ringing sounds. Professor Kethvar reached for his emergency communication device with trembling hands. "Class dismissed," he announced in a shaky voice. "Please exit in an orderly fashion. Danny Morrison of Earth, please remain seated." As the other students filed out of the room, many of them looking back at Danny with expressions of shock and fear, Danny sat alone, wondering what he had done wrong. He had only been trying to participate in the discussion about historical wars. He had no idea that he had just caused the biggest crisis in the history of interspecies education. Danny sat alone in the empty classroom for 10 minutes before anyone came back. He looked at his notebook and wondered if he should have kept quiet about the 100 Years' War. The alien students had seemed really upset, but he couldn't understand why. On Earth, that war was just one small part of history that most people learned about in high school. The door opened and a human woman walked in. She was about 40 years old with short brown hair and kind eyes. She wore a blue uniform with patches on the sleeves that Danny didn't recognize. Behind her came Professor Kethvar, who still looked shaken. His crystal skin was a pale gray color now instead of its usual bright blue. "Hello, Danny," the woman said with a gentle smile. "My name is Dr. Neela Bright. I'm a war counselor here at the university. I help students deal with difficult information about conflicts and violence." Danny stood up politely. "Nice to meet you, Dr. Bright. I'm sorry if I said something wrong in class. I was just trying to participate in the discussion." Dr. Bright sat down in the chair next to him. Professor Kethvar remained standing near the door, as if he was afraid to come closer. You didn't do anything wrong, Danny. But we need to talk about some important differences between human history and galactic history. Professor Kethvar called an emergency meeting with all the other teachers, Dr. Bright explained. They're very concerned about what you shared in class today. The casualty numbers you mentioned are much higher than anything they've ever heard. But Danny frowned. But it was just the 100 Years' War. That's not even close to being our worst conflict. We've had lots of wars that were much bigger and more deadly. Professor Kethvar made a sound like breaking glass and had to sit down. His crystal skin flickered between different shades of blue and gray. Dr. Bright quickly went to help him. "Professor, are you all right?" she asked. He said there were worse wars than the one that killed 3 million beings. Professor Kethvar whispered. "How is that possible? How does any species survive such destruction?" Dr. Bright looked back at Danny with a worried expression. "Danny, I need you to understand something very important. The Great Unification Wars that Professor Kethvar was teaching about today are considered the most violent period in all of galactic history. 347 deaths over 30 years represents unimaginable carnage to everyone else in the galaxy." "But that's hardly any deaths at all," Danny said, still confused. "I mean, I'm sorry for those people who died, but 300 people over 30 years isn't really a war. That's more like a small fight." Professor Kethvar's glow went out completely, and Dr. Bright had to call for medical help. 2 small robots rolled into the room and began checking the professor's vital signs. One of them injected him with something that made his crystal skin start glowing again, but very faintly. "Danny," Dr. Bright said seriously, "I need you to promise me something. Until we can figure out how to handle this situation, please don't mention any more human wars or conflicts to other students. Can you do that for me?" Danny nodded, even though he didn't really understand why it was such a big problem. "Sure, Dr. Bright. But can I ask you something? How do these alien species solve their problems if they don't fight wars?" "They talk," Dr. Bright said simply. "When the Zephyrians and Aquarians had a disagreement about mining rights 50 years ago, they held discussions for 6 months until they reached an agreement. When the Verdani wanted to expand their territory, they asked permission from their neighbors and worked out a fair trade. The idea of killing someone to solve a problem is completely foreign to them." While they were talking, Danny could hear activity in the hallway outside. Voices were speaking in different alien languages, and he could hear the sound of many feet moving quickly. His translation badge picked up fragments of conversation. "Impossible casualty numbers," someone was saying. "How can any species be so violent and still exist? We need to review all safety protocols immediately." Dr. Bright's communication device started beeping. She answered it and listened for a moment before her face went pale. "Yes, I understand. I'll be right there." She looked at Danny with concern. "The University Council is meeting in emergency session. They want to know everything about human history and warfare. Danny, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course," Danny said. "Is the 100 Years' War really considered a small conflict by human standards?" Danny thought about it. "Well, yeah. I mean, it's famous because it lasted so long and changed some political stuff in Europe, but in terms of casualties, it's not that big. World War II killed about 70 million people in 6 years. The Mongol conquest killed maybe 40 million people over about 150 years. The An-Lushan Rebellion in China killed around 36 million people in 8 years. Dr. Bright was writing notes as fast as she could. Professor Kethvar had recovered enough to listen, but his crystal skin kept flickering weakly. "Danny," Dr. Bright said carefully, "have humans been fighting wars continuously throughout your history?" "Pretty much," Danny said. "I read somewhere that there have only been about 250 years in all of recorded human history when there wasn't a war happening somewhere on Earth. But that's spread out over thousands of years, so it's not like the whole planet was always fighting." Professor Kethvar made that glass-breaking sound again, and the medical robots had to give him another injection. "How many different ways have humans invented to kill each other?" Dr. Bright asked, her voice getting quieter. Danny shrugged. "I don't know the exact number. Hundreds, probably. Maybe thousands if you count all the different types of swords and guns and bombs. My archaeology program covers the development of Weapons from stone axes to nuclear missiles. Nuclear missiles? Professor Kethvar whispered. Oh yeah, Danny said, warming to the subject. Those are weapons that can destroy entire cities in one explosion. We built thousands of them during the Cold War. For a while, humans had enough nuclear weapons to destroy all life on Earth several times over. The medical robot started beeping urgently and began working on Professor Kethvar again. Dr. Bright put her hand to her forehead like she had a headache. Danny, she said slowly, I need you to go to your dormitory room and stay there for the rest of the day. Don't talk to any other students about human history. Don't mention wars, weapons, or anything violent. Can you do that? Sure, Danny said, still puzzled. But Dr. Bright, are you feeling okay? You look kind of sick. I'll be fine, she said, though she didn't sound fine. I just need to process some of this information. And Danny, I'm going to need to review your academic records and your thesis topic. Danny picked up his backpack. My thesis is about siege warfare through the ages. I'm comparing how different human civilizations attacked and defended cities, from ancient Mesopotamia to modern times. It's really interesting how creative people got with catapults and cannons and stuff. Dr. Bright closed her eyes and took several deep breaths. Your thesis is about siege warfare. Yeah, it's about how armies would surround cities and try to break through the walls to capture them. Sometimes sieges would last for months or even years. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days and killed over 1 million people just from starvation and disease. Professor Kethvar's crystal skin went completely dark, and the medical robots announced that he had fainted. Dr. Bright quickly called for more medical help and told Danny to go to his room immediately. As Danny walked across the campus, he noticed that groups of alien students were gathered together, talking in worried voices. When they saw him coming, they would stop talking and move away. Some of the Verdani students' leaves turned dark colors when they looked at him, and the Aquarians changed to pale, frightened shades. Danny was starting to realize that he had caused some kind of serious problem, but he still didn't understand what it was. He had just been sharing historical facts, the same kind of information he learned in school back on Earth. He had no idea that what humans considered normal history was completely terrifying to every other species in the galaxy. Danny spent the night in his dorm room reading his galactic history textbook. He wanted to understand why everyone had gotten so upset about his comments in class. As he read about the different alien civilizations, he started to see the problem. The textbook described something called the Corvani Blood Wars as the most savage conflict in ancient galactic history. Danny read the chapter twice to make sure he understood it correctly. The Corvani Blood Wars had lasted for 12 years and involved ritual combat between chosen warriors. The total death count was 18 people, and the book described it as an orgy of violence that shocked the civilized galaxy. Danny put the book down and stared at the ceiling. On Earth, 18 deaths wouldn't even make the local news unless they all happened in one place on the same day. He was starting to understand why Dr. Bright and Professor Kethvar had looked so scared. The next morning, Danny arrived at his history class to find a very different scene. Instead of one professor, there were now 3 war counselors sitting at a table near the front of the room. Dr. Bright was there, along with 2 other humans he hadn't met before. Professor Kethvar stood behind them, his crystal skin still pale and flickering weakly. The alien students entered the classroom much more quietly than before. The Zephyrians sat together in one corner, their skin colors muted and dim. The Aquarians had turned gray and kept their tentacles wrapped tightly around themselves. The Verdani students' leaves were brown and drooping, which Danny's guidebook said meant they were depressed or frightened. Dr. Bright stood up when everyone was seated. Good morning, class. Before we continue with today's lesson, I want to introduce you to my colleagues. This is Dr. Pete Hamilton and Dr. Lisa Carter. They're here to help provide support during our discussions of historical topics. Professor Kethvar stepped forward carefully. Today we will be studying ancient galactic civilizations and their cultural practices. We will discuss the Corvani civilization and their warrior traditions. He paused and looked nervously at Danny. These topics may be disturbing, so please remember that the counselors are here to help if you need support. Danny raised his hand. He had been thinking about this all night and wanted to show that he could participate without causing problems. Professor, I read about the Corvani in my textbook last night. Their ritual combat system sounds really interesting. It reminds me of something humans had called gladiatorial games. All three war counselors immediately stood up. Dr. Bright held up her hand toward Danny. Danny, maybe we should discuss this privately after class. But Danny was excited to finally make a connection between human and galactic history. It's okay, Dr. Bright. I understand now that I need to be more careful about how I explain things. The gladiatorial games were similar to Corvani ritual combat, but on a much larger scale. Gladiators were fighters who would battle each other in big arenas for entertainment. Professor Kethvar's crystal skin brightened a little. That sounds similar indeed, Danny Morrison. Did these gladiators fight until one yielded, like the Corvani warriors? Not exactly, Danny said. They usually fought until one of them died. The crowds would decide whether a defeated gladiator lived or died by giving thumbs up or thumbs down. Most of the time, they chose death, because it was more exciting to watch. The Verdani student in the front row made a choking sound and her leaves began falling off rapidly. Two Aquarians near the back started changing colors so quickly, they looked like flashing lights. Dr. Hamilton quickly moved toward the distressed students while Dr. Carter activated her emergency communication device. But Danny kept talking, thinking he was being helpful by explaining the differences. The really big difference was the scale, Danny continued. The Corvani had maybe one ritual combat every few months, right? But Romans would have dozens of gladiators fighting at the same time. The Colosseum in Rome could hold 50,000 people who would all cheer and scream while watching people kill each other for fun. A Zephyrian student's crystal skin cracked with a sharp sound, and she fell out of her chair. Professor Kethvar was making continuous glass-breaking noises and had to lean against the wall for support. And it wasn't just gladiators fighting gladiators, Danny went on, warming to his subject. Sometimes they would flood the arena and have mock naval battles with real ships and hundreds of fighters. Sometimes they would release wild animals to hunt people or make criminals fight lions and bears without any weapons. Dr. Bright was frantically signaling for Danny to stop, but he was focused on explaining the historical facts clearly. The really crazy part was that this wasn't even considered unusual. Romans thought it was normal entertainment like going to movies. They did this for hundreds of years, and some emperors would put on games that lasted for weeks with thousands of people dying just for fun. 3 more Verdani students collapsed, their leaves scattering across the floor like snow. The Aquarians in the back were now making high-pitched whistling sounds that Danny's translator couldn't interpret, but which sounded like screaming. Dr. Carter was speaking rapidly into her communication device. Medical emergency in classroom 7. We need immediate psychological support for multiple students, and get me Chancellor Morden on the emergency line. Professor Kethvar slid down the wall and sat on the floor, his crystal skin completely transparent now. Thousands, he whispered. Thousands dying for entertainment. How is this possible? Danny finally realized that something was going very wrong. The alien students were having what looked like panic attacks, and the war counselors were running around trying to help them. He stood up from his seat, confused and worried. Is everyone okay? Danny asked. I was just explaining the historical context. The gladiatorial games ended a long time ago. Humans don't do that kind of stuff anymore. Dr. Bright turned to look at him with an expression of horror and exhaustion. Danny, please stop talking. Right now. Don't say another word about human history. But Danny was confused and wanted to help. I was just trying to show how human entertainment has changed over time. Modern humans watch sports and movies instead of real fighting. We've gotten much more civilized. More civilized? Squeaked a Zephyrian student who hadn't fainted yet. You used to watch thousands die for fun and you call yourselves more civilized now? Danny nodded earnestly. Oh yes, much more civilized. We don't have gladiatorial games anymore. Now when we want to watch violence for entertainment, we just make movies about it. And our modern wars are much more organized and efficient than ancient ones. Dr. Hamilton grabbed his emergency medical kit and started treating a Verdani student who was hyperventilating so badly, her leaves were turning black. Dr. Carter was still talking rapidly into her communication device, requesting immediate evacuation. Procedures for traumatized students. Danny, Dr. Bright said in a voice that was barely controlled, I need you to leave the classroom right now and go directly to my office. Do not speak to any other students on the way. Do not mention anything about human history, entertainment, wars, or anything related to violence. But I was just getting to the interesting part about how human warfare evolved, Danny said. I wanted to explain how we developed better strategies and weapons over time. Like the Romans were pretty good at fighting, but they had nothing compared to what humans figured out during World War II. Professor Kethavar made a sound like an entire chandelier falling downstairs and fainted completely. The remaining conscious students began making distressed noises in their various alien languages. Dr. Bright closed her eyes and took several deep breaths. When she opened them again, she looked like she had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. Danny Morrison, she said very slowly and clearly. Go to my office now. Sit in the chair. Do not talk to anyone. Do not think about human history. Just sit quietly until I get there. As Danny left the classroom, he could hear Dr. Carter declaring, a campus-wide emergency and requesting immediate crisis counseling for the entire student body. Through the windows, he could see medical vehicles arriving from across the campus. Danny walked to Dr. Bright's office feeling more confused than ever. He had been trying so hard to be helpful and educational, but somehow everything he said just made things worse. He sat in the chair as instructed and tried not to think about all the fascinating historical parallels he could have shared if only everyone hadn't gotten so upset. Danny sat in Dr. Bright's office for 2 hours before she returned. The office was small but comfortable, with soft chairs and calm lighting. The walls were covered with certificates and photos of Dr. Bright working with different alien species. Danny noticed that many of the photos showed aliens who looked upset or scared, with Dr. Bright helping them feel better. When Dr. Bright finally arrived, she looked exhausted. Her hair was messy and her uniform was wrinkled. She carried a stack of papers and data tablets that she dropped heavily on her desk. Behind her came 2 other people Danny hadn't seen before. Danny, Dr. Bright said as she sat down, I need you to meet some important people. This is Dr. Alan Roberts, the head of human psychology at the university, and this is Chancellor Morden, the leader of the entire Galactic Educational Consortium. Danny stood up politely to shake hands. Dr. Roberts was a tall man with gray hair who smiled kindly at Danny. Chancellor Morden was the strangest alien Danny had seen yet. He looked like he was made of flowing silver light that sometimes took the shape of a person and sometimes just floated in the air like a cloud. Hello, Danny Morrison of Earth, Chancellor Morden said in a voice that sounded like music. We have much to discuss. Dr. Bright pulled out a data tablet and looked at it with tired eyes. Danny, I spent the last 2 hours researching human history. I've read about your wars, your weapons, and your methods of fighting. I need you to help me understand something. She touched the tablet, and numbers appeared in the air above it. According to my research, humans have been in a state of continuous warfare somewhere on your planet for over 3,400 years. Is this correct? Danny nodded. That sounds about right. There's always been some kind of conflict happening somewhere on Earth. But usually it's just small wars between countries, not big global things. Chancellor Morden's silver form flickered and dimmed. Small wars, he repeated slowly. Dr. Roberts leaned forward in his chair. Danny, can you help us understand how humans can live with so much violence? How does your society function when there's always fighting going on? Danny thought about it carefully. He wanted to give a good answer because these people seemed really worried. Well, most humans never actually see any fighting. Wars usually happen in specific places, and regular people just live their normal lives. It's not like the whole planet is a battlefield, but the scale of your conflicts, Dr. Bright said, looking at her notes. Your American Civil War alone killed more people than have died violently in the entire recorded history of our galaxy. How do you process that kind of loss? I guess we just accept it as part of history, Danny said. We learn about it in school so we can understand why it happened and hopefully not make the same mistakes again. Every human kid learns about wars. But we also learn about all the good things people have done. Chancellor Morden flowed closer to Danny's chair. You teach your children about violence? We teach them about history, Danny corrected. Some of history is violent, but some of it is about art and science and exploration. We don't just focus on the bad stuff. Dr. Bright looked at another page of her notes. Danny, I found information about something called the Holocaust. Can you explain what that was? Danny felt his stomach tighten. The Holocaust was one of the worst things humans had ever done. And he wasn't sure how to explain it to aliens who thought 300 deaths was an unimaginable tragedy. The Holocaust was during World War II, Danny said slowly. Some bad people decided they hated certain groups of other people. They built special camps where they killed millions of innocent people just because of their religion or race or other things they couldn't control. The office became completely silent. Chancellor Morden's silver light dimmed until he was barely visible. Dr. Roberts closed his eyes and rubbed his forehead. Dr. Bright stared at Danny with an expression of horror. How many millions? Dr. Bright whispered. About 6 million Jewish people, Danny said quietly. Plus millions of other people they didn't like. Roma people, disabled people, political prisoners, and others. Maybe 11 or 12 million people. Total. Chancellor Morden made a sound like wind chimes in a storm. 12 million beings killed because of hatred, he said. How does your species survive such evil? Danny had never thought about it that way before. I guess because most humans aren't evil. The Holocaust was terrible, but it was done by a small group of really bad people. Most humans fought against them. That's why we had World War II, to stop the people doing those horrible things. So humans fight wars to stop other humans from doing evil things? Dr. Roberts asked. Sometimes, Danny said. We also fight for stupid reasons like wanting more land or resources. But yeah, sometimes we fight to protect people who can't protect themselves. Dr. Bright pulled up more information on her tablet. I've been reading about human peacekeeping forces, international laws about war, and organizations that try to prevent conflicts. It seems like humans have also created systems to reduce violence. Danny nodded enthusiastically. Oh yeah, we've gotten much better at that. We have the United Nations that helps countries solve problems without fighting. We have laws about how wars should be fought if they have to happen. We've banned certain weapons that are too cruel, like poison gas and biological weapons. You have laws about war? Chancellor Morden asked, his silver form brightening slightly. The Geneva Conventions, Danny explained. They say things like, you can't hurt prisoners, you can't attack hospitals or schools, and you have to help wounded soldiers even if they're your enemies. Most countries follow these rules. Dr. Roberts was taking notes as Danny talked. So humans have developed ethics around violence. You've created rules to make fighting less harmful. We try, Danny said. We're not perfect at it, but we keep working on it. Most modern humans think war is terrible and should be avoided if possible. We just disagree sometimes about when it's necessary. Dr. Bright looked at her tablet again. Danny, I found information about human military technology. You mentioned nuclear weapons yesterday. How many of those do humans have? Danny shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Well, it's classified information, but I think there are still thousands of them around the world. During the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union built enough nuclear weapons to destroy all life on Earth several times over. Chancellor Morden's silver form expanded and contracted rapidly, like he was breathing hard. You built weapons that could destroy your entire planet? But we didn't use them, Danny said quickly. That's the important part. Humans realized that nuclear war would be so terrible that nobody could win it, so we made agreements to reduce the number of weapons and promised not to use them except in the worst emergencies. You have weapons that could kill everyone on your world, but you choose not to use them? Dr. Roberts asked. Right, Danny said. We call it nuclear deterrence. Everyone is so scared of what would happen that nobody wants to start a nuclear war. It's kind of like how you don't punch someone much bigger than you because you know they'll punch you back harder. Dr. Bright was quiet for a long time, reading through her notes. Finally, she looked up at Danny with a strange expression. Danny, I think I'm starting to understand something. Humans aren't violent because you enjoy hurting people. You're violent because you feel things very strongly. What do you mean? Danny asked. You fight wars to protect people you care about. You created laws to make war less cruel. You built terrible weapons but chose not to use them. Everything you've told me suggests that humans fight because you have strong emotions about right and wrong. Chancellor Morden flowed closer again. Young human, is it true that your species would risk your own lives to protect strangers? Danny thought about all the stories he knew of people jumping into rivers to save drowning children, running into burning buildings to rescue trapped people, or soldiers sacrificing themselves to protect their friends. Yeah, humans do that all the time. We have firefighters and police and soldiers whose whole job is protecting other people, even if it's dangerous. Fascinating, Chancellor Morden said. A species that perfected the art of war, but uses that same passion to protect the innocent. 3 days later, Danny found himself standing in the biggest meeting room he had ever seen. The Galactic Educational Consortium had called an emergency session, and representatives from dozens of different alien species had come to discuss what they were now calling the human history problem. The room was shaped like a giant bowl, with seats arranged in circles going up toward the ceiling. Danny stood at the very center, feeling very small and nervous. Around him sat hundreds of aliens, all staring at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to fear to confusion. Chancellor Morden floated above the gathering, his silver form bright and commanding. We are here today to address an unprecedented situation, he announced. We have learned things about human history that challenge everything we thought we knew about civilized behavior. Danny looked around at all the different species. He saw Zephyrians with their crystal skin, Aquarians with their tentacles, and Verdani with their leaf-covered bodies. But there were also aliens he had never seen before. Some looked like walking flowers, others like living rocks, and a few that seemed to be made of pure energy. Young Danny Morrison of Earth, Chancellor Morden said. These representatives have come from across the galaxy to understand your species. They have read the reports about human warfare, and they are troubled. Can you help us understand how humans can be both violent and peaceful? Danny took a deep breath. He had been preparing for this moment for 3 days, with help from Dr. Bright and Dr. Roberts. Honored representatives, he began, using the formal address Dr. Bright had taught him. I think the confusion comes from looking at human violence without understanding why we fight. A tall alien that looked like a walking tree with purple bark raised one of its branch-like arms. Speak, young human, we are here to learn. Humans don't fight because we enjoy hurting people, Danny said, his voice getting stronger as he continued. We fight because we care very deeply about things. We care about our families, our friends, our beliefs, and our freedom. Sometimes we care so much that we're willing to die to protect those things. An alien that looked like a giant butterfly with 6 wings fluttered in its seat. But surely there must be other ways to solve problems without violence? Danny nodded. You're absolutely right, and humans have been learning that lesson for thousands of years. Every war we've fought has taught us something about the cost of violence. That's why we created international laws, peace treaties, and organizations like the United Nations. Chancellor Morden's silver form pulsed with interest. Tell them about the concept you explained to me yesterday, Danny. The idea of never again. Danny looked up at the hundreds of alien faces watching him. Never again is something humans say when we've experienced something terrible. After the Holocaust, where millions of innocent people were killed, humans said never again and created laws to prevent genocide. After World War II, we said never again and built international courts to punish war criminals. A small alien that looked like a floating crystal spoke in a voice like tinkling bells. But humans still fight wars. How can you say never again and then continue fighting? Because we're not perfect, Danny admitted. Humans make mistakes and sometimes we fail to live up to our own ideals. But each time we fail, we try to learn from it and do better next time. We're always working toward a more peaceful world, even if we don't always succeed. Dr. Bright stood up from where she had been sitting near the edge of the gathering. If I may add something, she said, I've spent the last week studying human psychology and history. What I've discovered is that the same emotional intensity, That makes humans capable of terrible violence also makes them capable of incredible sacrifice for others. She activated a holographic display that showed images and data above Danny's head. Humans will risk their lives to save strangers from burning buildings. They'll donate organs to people they've never met. They'll travel across the world to help victims of natural disasters. The images showed human firefighters, doctors, peacekeepers, and volunteers helping people in need. The alien representatives watched with growing amazement. The passion that drives humans to war, Dr. Bright continued, is the same passion that drives them to protect the innocent, fight injustice, and sacrifice themselves for the greater good. An alien that looked like a living gemstone with multiple facets spoke up. Are you saying that human violence comes from love rather than hatred? Danny thought about that question for a moment. Sometimes it does. Humans fight to protect their children, their homes, their way of life. But sometimes we also fight because of fear or greed or stupidity. The important thing is that we keep trying to choose love over hatred. Chancellor Mordun flowed down closer to Danny. Young human, we have a proposal for you. Would you be willing to help us understand not just human violence, but how your species learned to channel that intensity toward creation rather than destruction? Danny's face lit up with excitement. I would love to help with that. Human history isn't just about wars and fighting. We've also created amazing art, music, literature, and scientific discoveries. Some of our greatest achievements came from the same passion that caused our worst conflicts. A representative from the Ethereal Coalition, a species that looked like shifting clouds of light, spoke in a voice like wind through leaves. We propose the creation of a new academic program, the Human Cultural Integration Project, with Danny Morrison as our first cultural ambassador. The gathering murmured in dozens of different languages as the representatives discussed this idea among themselves. Finally, Chancellor Mordun called for order. All in favor of the proposal? He asked. Hundreds of different appendages, tentacles, branches, and energy patterns were raised in agreement. The vote was unanimous. Danny Morrison of Earth, Chancellor Mordun announced formally, you are hereby appointed as the first human cultural ambassador to the Galactic Educational Consortium. Your mission is to help us understand how a species can look into the darkness of its own capacity for destruction and choose, again and again, to build something better. Danny felt tears in his eyes as he looked around at all the alien faces that had gone from fear to understanding. Thank you, he said. I promise I'll do my best to help bridge the gap between human history and galactic understanding. Over the following months, Danny's history classes became voluntary seminars attended by graduate students from across the galaxy. Instead of focusing on the violence itself, they studied humanity's long journey toward peace. Students learned about human rights movements, the development of international law, and the countless individuals who had chosen compassion over hatred. The War Counselor requirement remained in place, but now it served a different purpose. Instead of protecting alien students from traumatic information, the counselors helped them understand how a species could transform its capacity for destruction into a force for protection and peace. Danny's thesis project evolved too. Instead of just studying siege warfare, he wrote about why peaceful species need to understand violence to maintain peace. The paper became required reading at universities throughout the galaxy. Professor Kethvar, who had recovered from his shock, became one of Danny's strongest supporters. I have learned, he told his colleagues, that sometimes the species that have experienced the greatest darkness are the ones most committed to bringing light to others. When Danny graduated with highest honors, representatives from dozens of worlds attended the ceremony. He had become more than just a student. He had become a bridge between humanity's violent past and its hopeful future. As he stood on the graduation platform, looking out at the crowd of humans and aliens who had become his friends, Danny realized that his greatest lesson hadn't come from any textbook. He had learned that understanding the worst of what people can do to each other is the first step toward ensuring they never do it again. And in classrooms across the galaxy, when students learned about the human concept of never again, they finally understood why Earth's former warriors had become the galaxy's most devoted peacekeepers.